Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, where flickering candlelight barely held back the darkness, and whispered stories of monsters walked the line between legend and terrifying truth. Before we begin this journey together, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy these deeper dives into history, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new here. I always love hearing where you're tuning in from, so drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's fascinating to see our community spanning different time zones and continents. Now, settle in. Perhaps dim your lights, let the soft hum of evening settle around you, and join me as we explore the most notorious figures who haunted medieval times. Not the knights and nobles celebrated in songs, but the shadows that made people bar their doors at nightfall and pray for dawn. You're walking now through the narrow, winding streets of a medieval town, somewhere in the heart of Europe. The year might be 1400, perhaps 1500. The exact date matters less than the feeling. Your footsteps echo against cobblestones worn smooth by countless others who have passed this way. Above you, timber-framed houses lean inward, their upper stories nearly touching across the narrow lane, creating a tunnel of shadow even in daylight. But daylight is fading now, and the world is transforming. The scent of wood smoke drifts from chimneys, mingling with less pleasant odors. Cooking meat, yes, but also the earthy smell of animals, the sharp tang of metalwork from a distant forge, and underlying it all, the ever-present reminder that sanitation in these times was, shall we say, rudimentary. This is a world where most people never traveled more than a day's walk from where they were born, where the forest beyond the fields might as well be another continent, dark and unknowable. You pause at a street corner, listening. In the distance, you hear the steady footfalls of the night watch. These are the men who patrol the darkness, carrying lanterns and staves, calling out the hours and keeping what order they can. Their voices echo off the walls. 10 of the clock, and all is well. But is it well? In a world where supernatural explanations sit comfortably alongside natural ones, where demons and angels are as real as the baker and the blacksmith. How do you distinguish between a monster of flesh and blood and something altogether more otherworldly? The medieval mind didn't draw the sharp lines between reality and superstition that we do today. If livestock died mysteriously, it might be disease or it might be witchcraft. If children disappeared, it could be wolves or it could be something far worse. This blurred boundary between the natural and supernatural world becomes crucial as we explore the figures who terrorized medieval communities. Because in many cases, the real monsters were human, but the explanations offered were anything but. Let's consider how information traveled in this world. There was no printing press in the early medieval period, no newspapers, no rapid communication. News moved at the speed of a walking man, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and wandering minstrels. A story that began in one village might be transformed entirely by the time it reached the next. Details would be added, embellished, made more dramatic with each telling. A cruel lord might become a demon. A series of unexplained deaths might become evidence of a pact with the devil. This is the world where our subjects lived and died, where their crimes were committed and their punishments carried out. It's a world where the line between criminal and supernatural entity was often drawn not by evidence, but by fear, superstition, and the limited understanding of human psychology that characterized the age. The legal system of medieval Europe was vastly different from what we know today. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal counsel, no protection against self-incrimination. Justice was often swift, brutal, and based on confessions extracted through torture, the rack, the thumbscrew, the strappado. These were not aberrations, but standard tools of medieval jurisprudence. Under such extreme duress, people would confess to almost anything. They would admit to making pacts with the devil, to transforming into wolves, to flying through the night sky. The question that haunts historians is this: among all these forced confessions, how many contained grains of truth? Religious beliefs shaped every aspect of medieval life, including how communities understood and responded to extreme violence. The Catholic Church taught that evil was real, tangible, constantly at war with good. Satan was not a metaphor, but a literal entity, commanding legions of demons who could possess human souls or make bargains with the weak-willed. In this context, a person who committed horrific crimes wasn't necessarily seen as mentally ill or sociopathic. They might be viewed as literally in league with the forces of darkness. This religious framework provided explanations for the inexplicable, but it also created a lens through which all extreme behavior was interpreted. A nobleman who tortured and killed might be seen as having made a demonic pact. A peasant who exhibited unusual strength or cunning might be accused of lycanthropy. The supernatural wasn't just possible, it was expected. Medical understanding in medieval times was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Mental illness, when recognized at all, was attributed to an imbalance of these humors, or to divine punishment, or to demonic influence. There was no concept of psychopathy, no understanding of the psychological factors that might drive someone to repeated acts of violence. The very notion that a person might kill for psychological gratification without any supernatural involvement was largely foreign to the medieval mind. This lack of psychological framework meant that when confronted with individuals who committed heinous crimes, medieval society reached for the explanations that made sense within their worldview. If someone killed repeatedly, brutally, without apparent motive, they must be under supernatural influence. They must be a werewolf, a vampire, a witch, or in league with the devil. Now, as we delve into specific cases, it's important to remember that we're not just examining individual criminals. We're exploring how an entire society understood and responded to extreme deviance. We're seeing how fear, superstition, political pressure, and the limitations of medieval justice combined to create narratives that persist to this day. Our first figure takes us to the highest levels of medieval French society. Gilles de Rais was not a shadowy peasant skulking in the forest. He was a Marshal of France, a companion in arms to Joan of Arc, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the kingdom. Born in 1404 into Breton nobility, He inherited vast estates that made him richer than most kings. His military career was distinguished. He fought bravely in the 100 Years' War, standing beside Joan of Arc during her most famous campaigns. When she was captured and burned at the stake in 1431, Gilles was there, witnessing the end of the woman who had seemed touched by divine grace. What happened to Gilles after Joan's death remains one of the most puzzling transformations in medieval history. The war hero began to change. He retreated to his estates, spending his enormous fortune with reckless abandon. He commissioned elaborate theatrical productions, hired armies of servants, and built a chapel dedicated to the Holy Innocents, staffed with a boys' choir that he personally selected. To his contemporaries, this might have seemed like the behavior of a man seeking spiritual redemption after years of warfare. But there were darker currents beneath the surface. Gilles became interested in alchemy, that medieval blend of chemistry, magic, and spiritual practice that promised to transform base metals into gold and perhaps unlock the secrets of eternal life. He invited practitioners to his castle, men who claimed they could help him contact supernatural forces, recover his lost fortune, and gain power over life and death itself. These alchemical experiments would later play a crucial role in his downfall. By the late 1430s, disturbing rumors began to circulate around Gilles' estates. Peasant children, mostly boys, were disappearing. They would last be seen approaching one of his castles, perhaps seeking alms or work, and then they would vanish. In a society where infant mortality was high and life was precarious, the disappearance of a few peasant children might not have attracted much attention. But the numbers kept growing, and the whispers grew louder. The rumors might have remained just that. Rumors, if not for Gilles' increasingly erratic behavior and his financial troubles. His vast fortune was nearly exhausted by his extravagant lifestyle. He began selling family properties, angering his relatives and the church, which held interests in some of his lands. When he attempted to reclaim a castle he had sold, leading an armed assault on the building during a religious service, he finally went too far. In 1440, Gilles was arrested on charges of heresy, sodomy, and the murder of children. The investigation that followed was unlike anything medieval France had seen. The testimony was so disturbing that parts of it were conducted behind closed doors. Witnesses described scenes of unimaginable cruelty. Servants spoke of secret chambers, of children brought to the castle who were never seen again, of rituals that combined sexual violence with what appeared to be sacrificial murder. Under the legal procedures of the time, Gilles was subjected to the threat of torture. The mere sight of the instruments was often enough to break a prisoner's resolve. Gilles confessed, in horrifying detail, to crimes that stunned even the hardened inquisitors. He admitted to the torture, sexual abuse, and murder of children, claiming that their deaths were connected to his alchemical experiments. He spoke of trying to summon demons, of believing that the blood and suffering of innocents might grant him supernatural powers. The number of victims claimed in his confession varied, but estimates ranged from 140 to as many as 800 children. Even allowing for medieval exaggeration and the unreliability of confessions extracted under duress, the scale was staggering. This was not a case of a few isolated murders, but of systematic predation that had continued for years. What makes Gilles de Rais particularly significant in the history of medieval crime is not just the nature of his alleged crimes, but his social position. This was not a marginal figure, a wandering beggar, or a suspected witch. This was a marshal of France, a hero the 100 Years' War, a man who had stood at the pinnacle of medieval society. His case demonstrated that evil in medieval thinking could corrupt even the highest levels of the social order. The investigation into Gilles' crimes also reveals the intersection of politics, religion, and justice in medieval France. His prosecutors included the Bishop of Nantes and the Duke of Brittany, both of whom had political and financial interests in his downfall. The church would gain control of his properties, while the Duke would eliminate a potentially troublesome vassal. This doesn't necessarily mean that Gilles was innocent, but it does suggest that his trial served multiple purposes beyond the pursuit of justice. The trial concluded with Gilles' execution in October 1440. He was hanged and burned, but not before making a public confession and expressing repentance for his crimes. Even in death, he remained a figure of contradiction, the war hero and the monster, the devout Christian and the alleged devil worshiper, the protector of France and the destroyer of its children. The case of Gilles de Rais became a template for how medieval society understood the corruption of nobility. It suggested that wealth and power, divorced from proper spiritual guidance, could lead to the most heinous crimes. It also demonstrated how alchemical practices, with their blend of natural philosophy and supernatural beliefs, could be seen as gateways to diabolic influence. Moving from the castles of the nobility to the forests and villages of rural Germany, we encounter a very different kind of figure, but one whose story reveals equally disturbing truths about medieval society and its understanding of extreme violence. Peter Stumpp, known to history as the Werewolf of Bedburg, represents perhaps the most famous case of alleged lycanthropy in European history. Peter lived in the countryside near Cologne in the late 16th century, a time when the Holy Roman Empire was convulsed by religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. He was, by all accounts, a prosperous farmer, a man of some standing in his community. He owned land, employed workers, and seemed to live the life of a respectable rural citizen. But beneath this facade, according to the accusations later brought against him, lurked something far more sinister. The region around Bedburg had been plagued by a series of brutal attacks. Livestock were found torn apart in ways that suggested no ordinary wolf. Travelers on lonely roads were attacked and killed, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Children disappeared from their homes and were later found dead in the forest, if they were found at all. The attacks seemed to follow a pattern that defied explanation. They were too frequent and too brutal to be the work of ordinary wolves, yet too calculated to be mere animal savagery. In the superstitious climate of 16th century Germany, where belief in werewolves was widespread, the conclusion seemed obvious. The region was being terrorized by a lycanthrope, a human being who could transform into a wolf and who combined human intelligence with bestial savagery. The hunt for this creature became a community obsession, with armed groups patrolling the forests and suspicious eyes turned toward neighbors who seemed to behave strangely. The capture of Peter Stumpp in 1589 marked the end of what locals had come to call the Reign of Terror. According to the pamphlets that circulated after his trial, he was taken during what amounted to a werewolf hunt, pursued by men with dogs through the forests near Bedburg. The accounts describe him being cornered and, in full view of his pursuers, transforming from wolf back to man. Whether this transformation was literal, metaphorical, or entirely fabricated remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Under interrogation, Peter's story unfolded like something from the darkest fairy tales. He claimed that his transformation into evil began when he was merely 12 years old, when the devil himself had appeared to him in the forest. The devil, according to Peter's confession, had given him a magical belt or girdle that allowed him to transform into a wolf at will. When he wore this belt, he became, in his own words, a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like fire. For 25 years, Peter claimed he had used this supernatural gift to satisfy an insatiable hunger for human flesh. His victims, he confessed, numbered in the dozens. Travelers on lonely roads, children who wandered too far from their villages, even members of his own family. He admitted to the most heinous act imaginable, describing how he would lure victims into the forest before transforming and tearing them apart. The confession included details so disturbing that even hardened medieval chroniclers struggled to record them. Peter claimed to have murdered his own son, luring the boy into the woods under false pretenses before killing him in wolf form. He spoke of acts of cannibalism, of consuming the flesh of his victims while they were still alive. He admitted to incest with his sister and daughter, to rape and torture, to a catalog of crimes that seemed to encompass every form of evil known to medieval imagination. What makes Peter Stumpp's case particularly significant is not just the nature of his alleged crimes, but the response they provoked. His trial and execution became a public spectacle, a demonstration of how medieval justice dealt with those accused of supernatural crimes. The execution itself was designed not just to end Peter's life, but to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted by diabolic powers. The punishment was elaborate and symbolic. Peter was strapped to a wheel and tortured with red-hot pincers, his flesh torn from his body in 10 places. His arms and legs were broken with the blunt side of an axe, ensuring that even if he somehow survived, he could never return to terrorize the community. Finally, he was beheaded and his body burned. But the spectacle didn't end there. His daughter and mistress, accused of complicity in his crimes, were also executed, flayed alive before being strangled and burned. The torture wheel on which Peter died was erected as a permanent monument, topped with the figure of a wolf and Peter's severed head. It stood for years as a reminder of what happened to those who made pacts with the devil. The message was clear. Supernatural evil would be met with overwhelming force, and the entire community would witness the consequences of straying from the path of righteousness. Modern historians examining Peter Stumpp's case face the same challenges that confront them with all medieval criminal trials. How much of his confession was true? How much was the product of torture and suggestion? How much was added by chroniclers eager to create a morally instructive tale? The pamphlets describing his crimes were bestsellers of their day, distributed across Europe and translated into multiple languages. They served not just as news reports, but as entertainment and moral instruction combined. The werewolf elements of Peter's story reflect deep-seated medieval beliefs about the relationship between humans and animals, between civilization and wildness. In medieval thinking, humans were separated from beasts by their rational souls and their relationship with God. To become a wolf was to abandon reason, morality, and divine grace. It was the ultimate form of corruption, a voluntary descent into pure animalistic evil. Yet, the story also reveals the political and religious tensions of its time. Peter was reportedly a Protestant in a region where religious conflict was tearing communities apart. Some historians have suggested that his trial might have been influenced by Catholic authorities seeking to demonstrate the spiritual dangers of Protestant belief. The emphasis on his pact with the devil could be read as a warning about the consequences of abandoning the true faith. The case of Peter Stumpp demonstrates how medieval society processed extreme violence through the lens of supernatural belief. Rather than seeking psychological explanations for his alleged crimes, his community understood them as evidence of diabolic influence. This interpretation served multiple functions. It provided an explanation for inexplicable evil. It reinforced religious beliefs about the reality of supernatural forces, and it offered a clear moral framework for understanding and responding to extreme deviance. But Peter's story also shows how the machinery of medieval justice could transform suspicion into certainty, rumor into fact, and fear into condemnation. The man who died on that wheel in 1589 may have been a serial killer, a victim of false accusation, or something in between. What we can say with certainty is that his case became a defining example of how medieval Europe understood and punished those accused of supernatural crimes. Take a moment now to reflect on these stories. If you're finding this exploration of medieval justice and its complexities as fascinating as I am, consider subscribing to join our community of history enthusiasts. And please, share in the comments below what aspects of these cases intrigue you most. The interplay of superstition and law, the political dimensions of medieval justice, or perhaps the psychological questions that remain unanswered centuries later. Let's continue our journey through the shadowed corridors of medieval history, moving now from the forests of Germany to the castles of Hungary, where we encounter a figure whose story has become so entangled with legend that separating fact from fiction requires the most careful historical detective work. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary. The Bathory name carried immense weight in Eastern Europe. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, was King of Poland. Her family controlled vast territories across Transylvania and Hungary, commanding armies and wielding influence that reached into the highest levels of European politics. Elizabeth herself was highly educated, fluent in several languages, and prepared from birth to take her place among the ruling elite. Her marriage in 1575 to Count Ferenc Nadasti seemed to cement her position at the apex of Hungarian society. Nadasti was a military hero, known for his campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, and their union brought together two of the most influential families in the region. Elizabeth moved to Chaktice Castle, a wedding gift that would later become synonymous with her alleged crimes. The early years of her marriage were marked by her husband's frequent absences on military campaigns. Elizabeth, left to manage vast estates and raise their children, demonstrated considerable administrative skill. She handled complex financial matters, supervised hundreds of servants, and maintained the family's political connections. By all accounts, she was an effective ruler in her own right, managing her domain with the same authority that her male relatives exercised over theirs. It was after her husband's death in 1604 that the first serious accusations began to surface. Elizabeth, now in her mid-40s and one of the wealthiest widows in Europe, found herself the subject of increasingly dark rumors. Servants were said to be disappearing from her castle. Young women who entered her service were never seen again. Whispers spoke of midnight rituals, of torture chambers hidden within the castle walls, of practices that defied Christian morality. The legend that has come down to us through the centuries paints Elizabeth as a woman obsessed with maintaining her youth and beauty. According to these stories, she believed that bathing in the blood of young virgins would preserve her appearance and grant her eternal youth. The tales describe elaborate torture devices, iron cages suspended from castle ceilings, and systematic murder carried out in pursuit of this grotesque beauty regimen. But here we must pause and consider the sources of these stories. The blood-bathing legend, which has become so central to Elizabeth's reputation, appears nowhere in the contemporary trial records. It was added to her story decades later, possibly influenced by vampire folklore that was becoming popular in Eastern Europe. The historical Elizabeth may have been guilty of terrible crimes, but the specific details that have made her famous may be largely fictional. What we do know from reliable sources is that in 1610, Elizabeth was investigated on charges of murdering young women in her care. The investigation was ordered by King Matthias of Hungary, but it was conducted by Elizabeth's own cousin, Georgi Thurzo, who had both political and financial interest in the outcome. If Elizabeth were convicted, her vast estates would be forfeit, and Thurzo, as her relative and the king's representative, would benefit significantly. The trial that followed was conducted not in open court, but through depositions taken from servants and witnesses. Many of these testimonies were obtained through torture, following standard medieval legal procedures. The accounts that emerged painted a picture of systematic cruelty within the castle walls. Servants described beatings, burnings, and other forms of torture inflicted on young women. They spoke of bodies hidden in storage rooms, of victims who died from their injuries, of a reign of terror that had continued for years. The numbers cited in these testimonies varied wildly. Some witnesses claimed Elizabeth had killed dozens of women. Others suggested the count was in the hundreds. A few testimonies, possibly influenced by the interrogator's leading questions, pushed the number even higher. The variation in these accounts suggests either that the witnesses were uncertain about the actual scale of the alleged crimes, or that their testimonies were shaped by the expectations of their questioners. Elizabeth herself was never formally tried or convicted. Instead, she was imprisoned in her own castle, walled up in a set of rooms with only small openings for food and air. This unusual punishment reflected both her high social status and the political sensitivities surrounding her case. A public trial might have embarrassed the Hungarian nobility and exposed the extent to which powerful families could abuse their authority over peasants and servants. 4 of Elizabeth's servants were not so fortunate. They were tortured until they confessed to complicity in their mistress's alleged crimes, then executed in public as a demonstration of royal justice. Their deaths served to confirm Elizabeth's guilt in the public mind while allowing the authorities to avoid the complications that would have arisen from executing one of the most powerful women in Hungary. Elizabeth remained imprisoned until her death in 1614. During those 4 years, she became a figure of both fascination and horror across Europe. Stories of her crimes spread through the same networks that carried news of wars, plagues, and political upheavals. With each telling, the details became more elaborate, the crimes more heinous, the woman herself more monstrous. Modern historians examining Elizabeth's case have reached varying conclusions. Some accept that she was guilty of systematic abuse and murder, pointing to the consistency of certain elements in the witness testimonies and the apparent physical evidence found at her castle. Others argue that she was the victim of a conspiracy designed to seize her wealth and eliminate her political influence. They point to the financial interests of her accusers, the reliance on tortured confessions, and the absence of certain key details from contemporary records. What seems most likely is that Elizabeth Bathory represents a complex intersection of several historical phenomena. She may indeed have been guilty of abusing and killing servants and peasants, behavior that, while horrific, was not unknown among the medieval nobility. The rigid social hierarchies of the time meant that the lives of common people were often considered expendable by those in power. But her case also demonstrates how accusations of extreme criminality could be used as weapons in political and economic conflicts. Elizabeth's wealth and independence made her a target for those who would benefit from her downfall. The supernatural and legendary elements added to her story over time reflect the medieval tendency to explain extreme behavior through the lens of good versus evil, moral corruption versus Christian virtue. The story of Elizabeth Bathory has endured not just because of the alleged crimes themselves, but because it embodies enduring fears about unchecked power, female sexuality, and the corruption that can flourish in isolated, hierarchical communities. Her case shows us how medieval justice operated differently for different social classes, how political considerations could shape criminal proceedings, and how legend and fact could become so intertwined that separating them becomes nearly impossible. Perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth's story demonstrates the dangers of accepting historical accounts at face value. The blood-bathing Countess of legend may be largely fictional, a creation of later storytellers who found her actual crimes insufficiently dramatic. The historical Elizabeth Bathory was likely neither the innocent victim of conspiracy nor the supernatural monster of folklore, but something more complex and ultimately more human. As we move deeper into these medieval mysteries, we begin to see patterns emerging. The intersection of political power and criminal accusation, the role of torture in shaping confessions and testimonies, the way supernatural beliefs influenced how communities understood extreme behavior. These patterns become even more apparent as we examine our next case, one that illustrates how the machinery of medieval justice could destroy an innocent person as easily as it could punish a guilty one. Now let's turn our attention to a case that reveals perhaps the darkest aspect of medieval criminal justice: the destruction of an innocent person through the machinery of fear, superstition, and political manipulation. This story takes us to the countryside of Franconia in the early 17th century, where a series of child disappearances led to accusations that would ultimately claim dozens of lives. The region had been devastated by years of religious warfare. Catholic and Protestant armies had swept back and forth across the landscape, leaving behind burned villages, disrupted harvests, and populations on the edge of starvation. In such desperate times, communities looked for explanations for their suffering, and they often found them in the form of scapegoats, witches, heretics, and other supposed agents of evil. In 1626, children began disappearing from villages around Würzburg. At first, each disappearance might have been explained by ordinary causes. Children died frequently in the 17th century from disease, accident, or malnutrition. But as the numbers grew, and as bodies began to be found in circumstances that suggested violent death, panic began to spread through the region. The Prince Bishop of Würzburg, Julius Echter, was a zealous Catholic reformer who had made his reputation fighting Protestant heresy and rooting out witchcraft. Under his authority, the region had already seen numerous witch trials, and the machinery of accusation and confession was well established. When reports of the missing children reached his court, Echter saw not a series of isolated crimes, but evidence of a diabolic conspiracy. The investigation began with the arrest of several people on the margins of society: beggars, wanderers, and others who lacked the protection of established community ties. Under torture, these initial suspects provided the names of others supposedly involved in the conspiracy. Those individuals were arrested and tortured in turn, providing more names. The process fed on itself, each confession generating new accusations, each new arrest confirming the investigators' belief that they were uncovering a vast network of evil. One of those caught in this expanding web of accusation was a man we'll call Wilhelm, a farmer from a village near Würzburg. Wilhelm was not wealthy, but he was respectable, a man who attended church regularly and maintained good relations with his neighbors. He owned a small plot of land, supported a wife and children, and had never been suspected of any wrongdoing. Wilhelm's connection to the investigation was tenuous. One of the tortured suspects, desperate to end his suffering, had mentioned Wilhelm's name among a list of supposed conspirators. Perhaps Wilhelm had once quarreled with this man over a business matter. Perhaps their names were similar, and the torturer made a mistake. Perhaps the suspect simply chose a name at random, hoping to satisfy his interrogators. The reason didn't matter. Once Wilhelm's name appeared in a confession, his fate was largely sealed. Wilhelm was arrested at his home in the early hours of a winter morning. His wife and children watched as armed men bound his hands and led him away. They would never see him again. At the Prince Bishop's prison, Wilhelm found himself in a world where logic and evidence mattered less than the predetermined conclusions of his interrogators. The charges against Wilhelm were specific and horrifying. He was accused of participating in witches' sabbaths, of making a pact with the devil, and of murdering children in ritual sacrifices. The evidence against him consisted entirely of confessions extracted from other prisoners under torture. No physical evidence linked him to any crime. No witnesses had seen him commit any violent act. But in the legal framework of the time, the testimony of confessed witches was considered reliable evidence. Wilhelm's interrogation followed the established procedures of the period. He was shown the instruments of torture and encouraged to confess. When he maintained his innocence, the torture began. First, his thumbs were crushed in screws designed for that purpose. When he still refused to confess, he was suspended by his arms with weights attached to his feet. The pain was designed to be unbearable, and it was. But Wilhelm had a problem that his interrogators refused to acknowledge. He was innocent. He could not confess to crimes he had not committed, could not provide details about Sabbaths he had never attended, could not name accomplices in conspiracies that existed only in the fevered imagination of witch hunters. His continued protestations of innocence were taken as evidence of his stubborn adherence to evil, his refusal to repent and seek God's mercy. The torture continued for days, then weeks. Wilhelm's body was broken, his spirit nearly destroyed, but still he maintained his innocence. Finally, faced with the promise of continued torture or the threat that his family would be arrested as accomplices, Wilhelm broke. He confessed to everything his interrogators wanted to hear. In his forced confession, Wilhelm admitted to attending diabolic gatherings in the forest outside his village. He described in detail rituals that he had supposedly participated in, the murder of children whose names were provided to him by his interrogators, and his own corruption by supernatural forces. The confession was everything the witch hunters had hoped for, detailed, specific, and confirming their beliefs about the reality of the diabolic conspiracy. Wilhelm's execution was a public spectacle designed to demonstrate the triumph of Christian justice over diabolic evil. He was burned at the stake in the town square, his death serving as both punishment for his alleged crimes and warning to others who might be tempted by similar evil. The crowd that gathered to watch included some who knew Wilhelm personally, neighbors who had never suspected him of any wrongdoing. But the machinery of accusation and confession had transformed him in the public mind from a respectable farmer into a confessed agent of Satan. Wilhelm's case illustrates the most disturbing aspect of medieval criminal justice, its capacity for creating guilt where none existed. The combination of supernatural beliefs, torture-based interrogation, and political pressure could transform innocent individuals into confessed criminals. The process was self-reinforcing. Each confession confirmed the investigators' preconceptions, making them more confident in pursuing additional suspects. The witch hunt that claimed Wilhelm's life eventually burned itself out, but not before dozens of people had been executed. Some of the victims may indeed have been guilty of crimes against children. Others, like Wilhelm, were almost certainly innocent. The tragedy is that the very methods used to investigate the crimes made it impossible to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Wilhelm's story reminds us that medieval criminal justice was not simply primitive or ineffective. It was often actively harmful, capable of manufacturing guilt and destroying lives based on nothing more than suspicion and fear. The supernatural framework that medieval people used to understand extreme criminality could be turned against anyone who fell under suspicion, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. As you contemplate these stories from the darkened chambers of medieval justice, consider leaving a comment about what strikes you most powerfully. Is it the way political power could shield the guilty or destroy the innocent? The role that supernatural beliefs played in shaping criminal investigations? Or perhaps the human capacity for both extreme evil and terrible injustice? Your thoughts help shape our ongoing conversation about these fascinating and troubling chapters of human history. The cases we've examined tonight reveal medieval society's struggle to understand and respond to extreme violence within the framework of their time. Whether dealing with the genuine crimes of figures like Gilles de Rais, the legendary accusations against Elizabeth Bathory, or the tragic persecution of innocents like Wilhelm, medieval communities relied on supernatural explanations and brutal justice to make sense of incomprehensible evil. These stories persist not just as historical curiosities, but as windows into the medieval mind. They show us how fear and superstition could shape legal proceedings, how political power could influence criminal justice, and how the search for simple explanations of complex phenomena could lead to both revelation and terrible injustice. The werewolves, witches, and demons of medieval criminal trials were not just supernatural entities. They were conceptual frameworks that medieval people used to process experiences that challenged their understanding of human nature and divine justice. In creating these categories, medieval society revealed as much about its own fears and limitations as it did about the criminals it sought to punish. As you step back from these shadowed corridors of medieval history, the flickering candlelight begins to fade, and the cobblestone streets grow quiet once more. The watchman's calls echo one final time through the narrow lanes before silence settles over the sleeping towns. These stories of Gilles de Rais, Peter Stumpp, and countless others caught in the machinery of medieval justice remind us that the line between monster and victim, between truth and legend, was often drawn not by evidence, but by the fears and beliefs of an age we can barely comprehend. Perhaps the most chilling realization is not that such individuals existed, but that the very systems designed to protect communities could so easily destroy the innocent alongside the guilty. If these glimpses into our darker past have stirred your curiosity, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys through history's most intriguing mysteries. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, sleep well, knowing that the shadows of the past can teach us much about the light we seek today.